initially the union said, oh, the government should call an inquiry into this issue and fix it for us. And then at a rank and file executive meeting, one of the teachers from Wollongong, a satellite city outside of Sydney, put up their hand and said, why don't we do an inquiry ourselves? And from that piece of inspiration, the independent inquiry into public education was born. And the union had, as part of its reform process, had levied its members to create a public education fund and had raised $1 million of member fees to be able to be a pool of funding for public education campaigning. And they used these resources as a key plank to be able to launch this 18-month independent inquiry into public education. They knew it had to be independent, so that meant that actually no matter how much they wanted to, they couldn't do it on their own. So they had to reach out to other organisations, and they built a relationship with the Federation of Parents and Citizens, the key parent body, and asked them to join the coalition that was going to host this independent inquiry, and not only invited them to join, but actually said, if you're going to participate, you need to put some money on the table, you need to fund this as well. Of course, they didn't have the same level of resources as the union, but each partner funded it because each partner had an interest in seeing it happen. Together they hired an emeritus professor, an expert in education, who helped the inquiry act independently and conduct hearings across the province. And the hearings they conducted were not unlike the kind of work that Metro Vancouver Alliance may undertake into the future when working on its issues, because they looked and felt like a listening campaign. What would happen is the Professor Vincent would go to a school or a local community all the way across the province, and they would host a meeting. But the professor wouldn't sit down and ask and tell people what was going wrong. He'd ask them questions. He'd ask, what are some of the challenges you're facing in public education in the moment? What's some of the challenges you're facing in the school as a parent or a teacher or a community member? And if there was one thing you could change, what would it be? And over again, through regional towns, in the inner city, in the outer suburbs of the city, he would conduct these hearings and hear these stories about what people wanted from public education. And through it, assembled a report of 96 recommendations that he'd heard from across the state. Now, as nice as it is to come up with 96 recommendations, that's not a very actionable program. I mean, it's a nice, pretty vision, but it's not necessarily something you're going to be able to sharply win reforms on immediately. So the coalition then changed form. And of course, this had all been quite cleverly timetabled in relation to electoral politics, because one should be conscious always of the political opportunities that come when politicians want your vote. And so they timed it very cleverly. They'd run the hearing in 1 year previous to the election, and then from about 8 months before the election they started releasing reports, one at a time, because politicians don't have and the media certainly doesn't have a great attention span, so they released multiple reports, different issues. And then the coalition morphed, turned into a public education alliance, which involved the teachers' union, the parents' organisations, and brought in the school principal organisations. And together they narrowed down 96 demands into 6, and then they moved on a very sharp lobbying campaign to win those demands. Interestingly, part of their lobbying work first saw the Conservatives come on board with one of their key policy proposals, and then this town hall meeting was only a month out from, that I went on to leaflet, was only a month out from the election, and it was part of that process. Then 2 weeks before the election, the Labor government, who had been in cahoots with Murdoch only a few years earlier to denounce the union, announced at their launch of their election campaign that they would fund a $250 million program to reduce class sizes from kindergarten to year 2 kids. And they had won. It was remarkable. And they won because they couldn't have done it on their own. And they turned around the political climate, and they had won a major victory for social change, but they'd also galvanised relationships across the education community and involved their members in the process. It was a great example of a successful coalition. Now, only life always was success, right? The story then goes on, of course, that the union then, after this campaign, shifted into focusing more on wages and conditions and salaries. And unfortunately, some of the relationships they've built broke down over time. And, you know, so none of the stories in the book aim to be hagiographic, as much as I love all the coalitions that are involved. The attempt is to draw out the lessons about what made that coalition work so well during the period of the Vincent inquiry, but also some of the weaknesses that were present in those relationships that saw it fall apart. So we as organisers can learn and distill how to take the best out of their strengths and to counter some of the weaknesses that were identified. Just briefly, let me just paint a picture of some of the differences in the coalitions that I saw in the other countries. In the United States, the grassroots collaborative was quite different from the Public Education Alliance because it was a multi-issue coalition. And I make very clear that coalitions can be either issue-specific and be mobilised around a particular issue or even as broad as an agenda, but they can also work on multiple issues. But working on multiple issues takes a whole different kind of power at the table, and that's what we saw with the grassroots collaborative. They had some bitter experience around a living wage campaign, where it was a huge come one, come all coalition, where some people had a lot of capacity to move members and power, and some people didn't, and it would cause a lot of frustration between the organisations. So they formed the grassroots collaborative as an alternative space, and they spent a couple of years just building relationships before they worked on issues. And they worked on lots of issues. They worked on amnesty for undocumented migrants, they worked on driver's licences, they worked on state budget issues, and then they got drawn into a street fight against Walmart in 2003. Now, I'm not going to tell you the detail of the story, but let's just say it wasn't pretty at the start, this campaign. The United Food and Commercial Workers in Chicago were quite a business union. They were quite used to taking care of their members, but they weren't particularly used to broad-scale political campaigns, and Walmart really played them very effectively in the first year of the campaign. It was a very, very nasty campaign. It was a very race politics were a huge issue about the desire for the store being moved into a very low-income African-American community where bargains were desired versus the quality of jobs that were going to be there. It was a very tense campaign. But the grassroots collaborative, with its multi-issue agenda and its tight relationships, created a space for real creativity. And they turned this negative, hostile campaign, which was just no to Walmart, we were saying no, into a positive campaign that was about lifting up all the standards of retail workers in the city to be of living wages. And the best thing about the campaign was when all the organisations were able to share their strengths and share their diversity with each other. So at the height of the campaign, and the campaign was very long, it was 15 months of planning, and it was timetabled yet again to be in conjunction with mayoral elections that were coming up. But the beauty of the campaign was when they were lobbying individual aldermen. They'd have this organisation Action Now in the field, door-knocking houses, working in partnership with the labour unions who were walking the halls of the City Council lobbying the mayors. Lobbying the aldermen. And when they meet with an alderman who was hostile to the ordinance, they'd call up Action Now, and Action Now would bust their door knockers into a different electorate. And what they'd do is they'd go along, knock on the door, to have a conversation. If you were supportive of the living wage, they'd pass over the mobile phone, you'd call the alderman. So what you had was within a couple of hours of someone being shaky up at City Hall, you had 200 calls in their office and people started turning. Labor does the hall thing a lot, and Action Now does the street thing a lot, but this way they can came together in an unmitigating force. And what you saw, and it's interesting, Mayor Daley is now departing the scene, but the Daily Machine in Chicago is renowned. This was the first time in his reign, in 17 years, that an ordinance was passed without his support. And it was passed on the 26th of July, but Chicago politics is not that democratic, and he did have the right of veto, and a couple of months later, after this sort of threatened capital flight of retailers, he ended up exercising a veto and vetoing the ordinance. But even without that social change victory, the legacy lived on, because they'd smartly timetabled their battle, and some of the parties who were part of the grassroots collaborative then turned into working on political action, and 7 of the aldermen who had voted against the living wage were no longer councillors. Similarly, the energy from the living wage campaign was used to increase the minimum wage for workers in Illinois, and it now has the 2nd highest living wage in the country. And this year, Walmart came back to Chicago, but instead of ignoring unions, which it has systematically done in the United States, it's different in Canada. The union here is a little bit stronger. It's been not easy. I know that some of the stories, right? But you know, in the United States, systematically ignored unions. For the first time in its history, it sought a negotiation with unions in Chicago in moving in, and it's now agreed to pay above the minimum wage. This is the sort of political legacy that has come as a consequence of working in powerful coalitions. And just a drop in the ocean for the Canadian case study, the most interesting thing I felt about the Health Coalition in Ontario is that it set up a multi-scale structure. And what I mean by that is that it didn't just, in trying to represent the whole province, it didn't pretend that you could do that out of Toronto, right? As much as people in Toronto would like to have that happen, right? They knew that they couldn't move an agenda in a province that large, in a city that's so relatively small. And so since about 1999, and I studied them from 2001 to 2006, they, with the support of union activists, retired teachers, organisations like the Council of Canada, set up these coalitions, co-chaired by a community leader and a union leader, in towns like Thunder Bay and Windsor and Kingston, Peterborough, all across the province. And it's been an incredible force for their power, because often coalitions run out of steam. You know, the issue is exciting for a while, but you haven't brought your members with you. You don't know how to have them to enable them to meaningfully participate in the coalition. Your members tend to be engaged more as just turn out to a rally, and they fall away half the time. Instead, in Ontario, what you tended to do with the Health Coalition, people were actually engaged locally in coming up with strategies for how to run the health campaign in their local area. So they weren't just rent-a-crowd. People were actually strategists and organisers, and they were learning to work together. And that multi-scale structure has been critically important to really building a mass movement around healthcare that really did spearhead that Save Medicare campaign in relation to the Romanow Commission many years ago, that I'm sure some of you remember, and has been an active stalwart around the public-private partnerships campaign since. So let me just draw out a couple of key lessons from the book, and you know, there's plenty of lessons in the book. I'll just identify 3. So I reckon the most countercultural, unorthodox finding I had about coalitions is that I found that, as opposed to the idea that bigger is always better, that less is more when it comes to coalitions. Less organisations who are prepared to share more power between each other have produced a coalition that is far more sustainable and able to achieve long-term success than a letterhead coalition that's a mile wide and an inch deep. And they did this because they were more able to engage their members in the organisation, in the coalition work. They were more likely to have their own organisational interests present in the work of the coalition. They were more able to ensure that there was a meeting of minds between the organisational partners. And so in this sense, depth of participation was more important than breadth, especially when it came to issue-based coalitions that always had the sort of trajectory of, as the issues go up, the activity goes up; as the issue falls down, the activity falls down. And the Australian case study is a perfect example. 2 organisations ran an 18-month inquiry that secured $250 million worth of reform. But all of the coalitions had, to some extent, limited membership that was based on organisational interest.